Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our morning coffee time for Wednesday, September the 23rd. How is everyone? O genki desu ka? Which is Japanese for how are you? Things are well here at the Hermitage. Many things on today. One of them is preparing for a good soaking. We have some rain in the forecast for the next couple of days, which is just in time with the arriving of fall. And with all the fires we've had recently, a welcome blessing. So we're going to be tarping up our firewood because we still have our woodchuckers ball this weekend and want to keep things as dry as possible and be ready to move and stack cordwood for the winter, or maybe even for the next 2 winters since we're at it, and then get everything tarped up and ready for the rain as fall has begun. And hopefully a good portion of the West will enjoy a bit of rain, if not this weekend, but before too long. The air needs a good scrubbing, and there's still quite a few fires out there burning in the West that could use some dousing. So hope everything is looking and sounding okay this morning. I see a few people giving me the sign, the double thumbs up, so that's good to see. Yesterday we had Ladawan Konkarat and her husband Hiran come down from the Seattle area to offer the meal to the monks and celebrate her birthday. Ladawan is the one who organized and made up the masks, the 10th anniversary Pacific Hermitage masks. So, and she's here this morning, like many mornings. So it's nice to have a visit from them and receive meal offering. And both myself and Ajahn Kurundama gave a little owada, or reflection, for her and her husband. And they brought another ornamental maple and planted a beautiful little tree near the small Buddha image that Greg and his wife, who are often here in the morning, offered to the Hermitage before it even existed in its present form. Back in 2007, myself and Ajahn Kurundama were invited by the Portland Friends of the Dhamma to come and spend the summer retreat period up here in the gorge. And we had our first little impromptu hermitage over in Mosier, Oregon that summer. And Greg and Adrienne offered this beautiful little, I believe it's a Burmese style Buddha Rupa, or Buddha image. And it sits just outside the Hermitage house, looking in upon us. So we planted a nice little tree yesterday that Ladawan and Hiran brought down just behind that. So maybe I'll turn to questions. Nothing's really bubbling up in my mind as I go to reflection today. Maybe give a bit more time for questions today. If people have them, pop them in there. And I'll try to be relatively concise, so give myself the challenge of seeing if I can get through them all in the 25 minutes we have here. Okay, so the first 2 come from Eleanor, our number 1 questioner. Question about prayers again. did the Buddha talk about it? I think is what you mean there. And did he give instructions? I often want to ask for protection or use some sort of serenity prayer. Should we always pray for us and others at the same time, as in the may we all be free from suffering, and avoid praying for may I be free from? So there are instances, Eleanor, where the Buddha does talk about protective chanting. And there's a rich tradition in the Theravadan world of the monks being asked to do protective chanting. The background story in the commentaries for the Buddha actually giving or speaking on the Metta Sutta, giving the teaching on the cultivation of metta, is quite interesting story. The monks went off to live in a forested area and were hounded by non-human beings. Let's put it that way. And driven out of the forest that they went to sort of camp in to put forth effort and develop their practice. And when they came back to the Buddha and asked if there was anything they could do, the Buddha chastised them for not sharing merit with all the living beings in the forest, and gave the Metta Sutta. So there are several of these in our chanting books, both Volume 1 and Volume 2. In the Recollections and Reflections area of our chanting book, you'll find an English translation of the Metta Sutta, and that is said to have protective values. There are also other suttas that are traditionally thought as being protective. Simplest of them even is just to chant homage to the Buddha. So, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa, traditionally done 3 times, just to evoke and recite an homage to the Buddha is believed to have protective values. Certainly it steels the mind, or can steady the mind, and be a skillful means to check the slide into anxiety or fear or worry. But in Buddhist culture, it's believed that it has protective powers even beyond that. In Volume 2 of our chanting book, there are the auspicious chants, or the parita chants, and many of those have been used traditionally as something like a protective chant, or could say they are a prayer in part of the way that we think about prayer in Western cultures. So the second part of your question, should we always pray for all beings or others or ourself? And there's no real set thing there. Include yourself. But it's skillful sometimes to arouse the feeling of loving kindness, sometimes to bring various beings into mind, especially someone that we quite naturally feel goodwill towards. Ultimately, though, where we want to take the cultivation of these things is towards all beings in a undifferentiated way. Now, that's a very tall order, but ultimately, we want to just be generating goodwill and good wishes for all beings. And a lot of the metta verses that are used traditionally oftentimes are elucidating different beings, or raising different beings as targets of generating the good wish, as I call it. So also in the reflections and recollection area of our Volume 1 chanting book is another one of the metta refrains, which starts out with self. May I abide in well-being, in freedom from, and then there's a couple verses, and then it goes to other beings and everyone. So by all means, include yourself and radiate out to everyone. And cultivating those practices really can be quite centering and soothing, in addition just to being a form for developing loving kindness. One of the benefits of developing loving kindness is it does create a sense of safety and well-being in oneself and lessens the drift to states of fear and anxiety. So try that on for size. Hopefully that you'll find some usefulness in that. Ajahn Sumedho talks about conscious awareness. Ajahn Sumedho talks about conscious awareness as the only constant there is. Everything else is subject to anicca. What about when we sleep? Are the moments in between birth and death? Well, as Ajahn Sumedho often says in his talks, a lot of the way he's using these reflections is to stimulate an investigation into the subjective nature of consciousness. I mean, in Buddhist theory, if you examine the Pali Canon, it's not said quite in that way. Conscious awareness is constant. In the Pali Canon itself, everything is conditioned. The only thing that sits outside of conditionality is the cessation of dukkha, namely nibbana. But in subjective experience, there's this pervasive conscious awareness that one can recognize, and that's a great theme in Lumpur Sumedho's teaching, especially how that sits juxtaposed to the various arisings of self and identification and the various arisings of different mental states. So happiness arises, and typically we're identified with it. And the attention is on that which has arisen, and we're not all that skilled in noticing these as discrete states that arise and cease, and that are anicca, dukkha, and anatta. And in particular, we don't notice that whether for good or for evil, whether pleasurable or unpleasurable, liked or unliked, all these things arise and cease, and they arise and cease in this space of conscious awareness. And the recognition of that opens up a whole different way to understand the experience of mind and mentality and consciousness. And in particular, it opens up a whole opportunity for a way to relate to our conscious experience that is more free from suffering. If one looks to the text, the way consciousness is spoken about directly in the Pali Suttas is something that arises and ceases, and it doesn't match always so closely to the way Luang Por Sumedho is kind of reflecting on consciousness, which is a very just accessible reflection about the nature of subjective conscious experience. So, don't know if that helps SGB, but hopefully that's something for you to investigate and reflect on. Good morning, Shelley. Is fear always dukkha? Yeah, fear is an emotion or a state or a defilement that is dukkha. So there's no such thing as fear not being dukkha. And I think for many beings, it's probably one of the more profound and obvious forms of the defilements. One of the main groupings in the teachings is greed, hatred, and delusion. And I've often wondered why the Buddha didn't, instead of making it a 3-part model, a 4-part model, because fear seems to be such a large part of the experience of living beings in the human realm and the animal realm, which are the only 2 realms that I have any direct knowledge of. I oftentimes think of this as a fearful realm. And in observing animals, it's living in the forest and observing animals on a daily basis. Fear and anxiety seems to be a huge part of their conscious experience. Dear Ajahn, is vipassana and anapana practice the main technique for the purification of mind, or are there other effective techniques as well? Well, Samrit, vipassana is not a technique if one looks to the Pali Canon. Vipassana, insight, is the best translation for that, I think, is the byproduct of cultivating the Eightfold Path. So vipassana is the cultivation and development of wisdom. So it's a resultant rather than a technique. It's, in this day and age, it's kind of a bit of a brand for various meditation techniques. So it causes a bit of confusion, but I don't think of it as a technique. I look a little bit more to the way the term is used in the Pali Suttas. Anapana, shorthand for anapanasati, sati of in and out breathing, or mindfulness of in and out breathing. This, I wouldn't say this is the main technique for the purification of the mind. The main technique is the cultivation of the Eightfold Path. which is a development of view and speech and behavior and mental cultivation, including techniques, including mindfulness of breathing. But in the Pali Canon and in the teachings of the Buddha does give, or Anapanasati does have some special significance. So it is the meditative form used by Buddhas, and it's also one of the meditative forms that the Buddha said is suitable for all. So there's certain forms that are contraindicated for various temperaments and personality types, but Anapanasati is said to be suitable for all. And it's, according to my knowledge of the suttas, which is not authoritative or great, but according to my knowledge, it's probably the meditative technique that has the most detail in the suttas. Many of the other meditation techniques, as they surface in the body of the suttas, are not given a lot of detail. So Anapanasati seems to sit in a kind of special place in the suttas because the Anapanasati Sutta, and there's more than one of them, gives a lot of detail about how that can be used to cultivate the Eightfold Path. So it rightfully gets quite a bit of attention. Good morning, Jana. How to deal with / not respond to or react to or to protect from hate coming at one from angry persons. And this is a challenge. Hopefully we have a storehouse of loving kindness and equanimity and a heart that is strong in Dhamma, so that we can be somewhat clear-minded and patient in the presence of hatred and anger. If we've cultivated the practice and reflected a lot on the danger that exists in hatred and anger, the harm that exists in those mental states, hopefully we have the clear-sightedness when in the face of it that we don't immediately just kind of contract to relating to the experience through the lens of self and others and feel it as some sort of over-personalized challenge. I mean, I find it very helpful if I can have some sense of mindfulness that this other person is suffering and they're harming themselves and generating the conditions that make it more likely for me to harm myself or for others who are engaged in, exposed to this anger and hatred, to create bad karma and to create second and third responses of hatred and anger and harm to self and others. That's difficult to do. Oftentimes, we're so grounded in just taking refuge in favorable conditions and not being exposed to such a threat And sometimes our wisdom faculty isn't quick enough to be able to take on this, to directly kind of perceive that somebody is in a state of suffering. Just immediately becomes enemy, threat. How dare they? And there's thoughts of self and self-protection. But to be able to sort of see what's going on there from the light of Dhamma, to see dukkha, this person is suffering, I find very helpful in maintaining some sense of objectivity, some sense of equanimity, some kind of space to be able to respond in a skillful way. And then being sensitive to and heedful and determined to not harm oneself or others by reacting to that challenge in an unskillful way. So, as we become students of dukkha and students of hatred and anger and just how harmful it can be, how toxic it can be, hopefully we've developed a real sense of cautiousness and heedfulness around it. Almost like a wholesome sense of fear of the harm that it can cause. And that's what the Buddha is talking about in some of the teachings, where he's talking about not being heedless and cultivating a sense of heedfulness. It's like to see this as dangerous. And then acting in a way that is very careful and skillful, not to respond in any unskillful way oneself. Now, based on our karma and based on the strength of our mind in any given moment, everything happens so fast, it's difficult for there not to be some sense of anxiety or fear or anger that's provoked from such a challenge. But hopefully we have enough mindfulness and sensitivity that we quickly respond with our best efforts to resolve that, or at least protect and guard against that feeding some more pernicious or dangerous response to the challenge of facing angry persons or hatred. So maybe you yourself are provoked and you feel angry, but to guard against thinking in ways that will intensify that, guarding against speech, and most importantly, guarding against acting on that anger. And then, because of the danger of the situation, sometimes you might just need to keep your mouth closed. Sometimes you might need to just find some way to quickly resolve the situation or extract yourself from the situation to minimize harm. But a big part of the solution is having the wisdom to sort of see suffering and having this wholesome sense of cautiousness and fear about interacting in any way that creates harm for self or others. What is the correct way to pronounce the reciting of the 3 refuges out of the chanting book? Thank you. Well, I'm not perfect, but I'll give it my best. So I think, Christine, you're talking about the well, when we chant the 3 refuges, one, we start with Namo Tassa, And probably one of the main tips that I would give someone for correct pronunciation is to notice that there are short and long vowels. So namo is not namo. It's not it's a. So namo, namo. And then there's o, and there's, which is o, and there's o. So the long vowels have a line over them in our chanting book in the Romanized form, and the short ones don't. And look to the back to the pronunciation guide to refresh your mind about those. So that's one of the main sort of tips in getting the pronunciation and the rhythm right. And I think the other main tip that I give people, if I could just give you two recommendations for getting the pronunciation a little bit better, is to honor the fact when there are double consonants, like a TT or a DD or a TTH and a DDH. It's a little tricky in the Romanized because we see DH or TH as two letters, but that's really representing a single poly consonant that is aspirated. So there's a little puff of air after the d. So there's like a hard flat D, which is d, and then there's d. So there's a little puff of air there. When you see these double consonants, make sure you pronounce both of them, and that will create a stop. So namo tassa, both S's are pronounced. Namo, it's not namo tassa, it's namo tassa. Namo tassa, namo tassa. Bhagavato, arahato, samma, both M's. I believe there's two M's there. Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So that goes 3 times. And then Buddhang saranang gacchami. Dhammang saranang gacchami. Sanghang saranang gacchami. So I go to the Buddha for refuge. I go to the Dhamma for refuge. I go to the Sangha for refuge. So hopefully that helps. Also notice in there's like in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, there are some of these aspirated consonants. So Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. So that's a couple pointers for you there. Hopefully that helps out. Oh boy, I don't think I'm going to make it through these questions. It is already time to go. Okay, so I'm going to stop with this one here because I like it. Ajahn, would you comment on the purification of the mind? What does it feel like? What is the experience of the pure mind? Oh, how I wish I knew. I've had moments moving in that direction, but I cannot claim. If we're talking about Nibbana, I cannot claim to know what that experience is. But I have it on good authority, and it is a strong part of my faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, that the experience of the pure mind, it feels like the unburdening. It feels like peace. It feels like freedom. It is the ultimate cessation of any sense of burden. So if there's any sense of burdensomeness in the mind, then we're not there yet. And if the mind doesn't feel free, but that takes some study and some practice to kind of really get us our sense of what we might mean there by freedom, doesn't it? So anyways, I'll leave that as a little reflection on your question there. I apologize for the rest of you, but I do have to get on with my day. So if you have time, come back tomorrow with your questions and we'll deal with them then. Until then, be well, everyone. Guard your mind well. And may those beings be free from animosity, free from oppression, free from trouble, and look after themselves with ease. Those people stuck in hatred and animosity, especially. So be well, and we'll see you all tomorrow.